There is a particular kind of silence that only comes after catastrophe. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest. The silence of a world that does not yet know whether what just happened was the end of everything or the beginning of something it has no category to understand. It is the silence that follows an earthquake. The silence of a city that went to sleep holding its breath and woke up not knowing whether it dared exhale. That was Jerusalem on the morning of what we now call Holy Saturday, the Sabbath, the day between. The city had seen death before. Jerusalem had been conquered, burned, rebuilt, and conquered again more times than its stones could record. It had seen Roman crucifixions on the roads outside its gates, bodies left hanging as warnings to any who considered defiance. Death was not a stranger to this city, and yet something about the previous day had left a residue that the people of Jerusalem could feel but could not name. Something had happened that did not fit inside the normal vocabulary of death. Something had cracked. The sky had gone dark at noon. Not the gradual dimming of an approaching storm, sudden, total, inexplicable darkness in the middle of the day for 3 hours. Then a sound that every person in the city felt in their chest before they heard it. The earth moving beneath their feet. The stones of the road shifting. The walls of their houses shuddering. And in the temple, something that the priests who were on duty that afternoon would spend the rest of their lives trying to account for. The great veil, 60 feet of embroidered linen, 4 inches thick, requiring hundreds of men to move, had torn in two, from top to bottom, from the inside. No human hand had done it. And now, on Saturday morning, Jerusalem observed the Sabbath. The markets were closed, the roads were quiet. The smell of bread from the Passover celebrations still clung to the linen curtains in every home. Families sat together around the remnants of the Seder meal. And beneath the city, in the valleys of Hinnom and Kidron, and in the gardens carved into the limestone hillsides north of the Damascus Gate, the earth itself, according to the account of Matthew the tax collector, one of the men who had known the executed rabbi personally, had opened. Tombs had cracked, and bodies that had long been entombed had, in the moment of the teacher's death, been released. Whatever had happened on that Friday was not finished, but we are not here to study Saturday. We are here to study Sunday, the first day of the new week, the third day, the day that divided not just a religion, not just a culture, not just a civilization, but time itself. The question before us is not a theological abstraction. It is a historical claim, one of the most scrutinized and contested claims in the entire human record. It is the claim that on the morning of the 16th of the month of Nisan, in the 33rd year of the Common Era, in a garden tomb outside the north wall of Jerusalem, the body of a man who had been publicly and officially executed 2 days prior was no longer inside the tomb. Not because anyone had moved it, because it had left under its own power. To understand what that claim means, what it would have meant to the people who first encountered it, what it cost them to believe it, what it cost them not to believe it, we must walk back into that world. We must smell its air and hear its crowds and understand the specific categories of reality within which this event either fits or shatters everything. Because if it happened, it is not one event among many. It is the event, the single point around which all of history orbits, the moment in which the deepest question any human being has ever asked received not a philosophical answer, but a physical one. And if it did not happen, if it is legend, error, hallucination, or fraud, then what was built upon it is the most consequential deception in the history of the world, and the 2 billion people alive today who organize their lives around it are inhabitants of the most elaborate fiction ever constructed. There is no moderate position. Not on this. Let us begin. To understand why the resurrection mattered, and why the people who encountered it could not simply dismiss it and move on, you must understand 3 things about the world of first-century Judaism: what they believed about death, what they believed about resurrection, and what they believed was absolutely, categorically impossible about the kind of resurrection being claimed. First, death in the world of first-century Judaism was final in a way that the modern secular mind might actually find familiar. The Hebrew concept of Sheol, the realm of the dead, was not equivalent to the later Christian doctrine of hell, nor to the Greek concept of Hades, though the Greek-speaking Jews of the diaspora often used those terms interchangeably. Sheol was understood as the place to which all human beings descended after death, a shadowy, inactive existence. Not torment, not bliss, but a kind of diminishment. The vitality of life did not continue in Sheol. The dead did not participate in the affairs of the living. The dead rested, or perhaps more accurately, the dead waited. This is important. The Jewish world in which Jesus lived and died and was claimed to have risen did not expect the dead to come back. They wept at funerals. They observed formal mourning periods. They sealed tombs with heavy stones, not because they feared the dead would walk out, but because the sealing of a tomb was an act of finality, of farewell, of acknowledgement that what had been was now over. When Mary, the mother of Lazarus, met Jesus at the entrance to her village after her brother's death and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died," she was not being rhetorical. She was expressing a grief rooted in absolute conviction. Death was the boundary that could not be uncrossed. Even Jesus himself, standing before the sealed tomb of his friend, wept. The Gospel of John records this with the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. 2 words. A God who weeps because his friend is dead and the people around him are destroyed by grief. That is the world. Death was real. Death was final. Death was the one thing even the greatest prophets and teachers had not overcome. Second, resurrection, as a concept, was not unknown in first-century Judaism. It existed, but it meant something very specific. The Pharisees, one of the dominant religious parties of the time, believed in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees, who controlled the temple priesthood, did not. A disagreement Paul would famously exploit at his own trial, setting the 2 factions against each other by raising the subject. But the Pharisaic belief in resurrection was a collective, eschatological event. It would happen at the end of time, at the coming of the age of God's kingdom. All the righteous dead would rise together at once in a single cosmic event that would inaugurate the new creation. It was a future hope, a communal promise, not something that happened to one man, alone, in the middle of history, while the Roman Empire was still intact and most of the world had not heard of him. This is crucial, because when the disciples of Jesus began to claim that he had risen from the dead, they were not simply repeating a familiar religious idea in a new context. They were claiming something that had no precedent in their own tradition. They were claiming that the end-of-time resurrection had happened to one man ahead of schedule in the middle of history, before the world had ended, before the kingdom had come in its fullness, before anything had been resolved. The scholar N.T. Wright, in his exhaustive study of resurrection in the ancient world, puts the point plainly. No Jew in the first century, encountering a report that their teacher had risen from the dead, would have responded with the thought, "Oh, so he's gone to a better place." That is a modern, spiritualized idea. The Jewish concept of resurrection was bodily, physical, and public. If Jesus had risen, he had risen in a body, a transformed body, a glorified body, but a body. He could be touched, he could eat, he occupied space. This is not a spiritualized metaphor. This is a claim about physical reality. Third, and this is the point that modern readers most consistently underestimate, the claim being made by the disciples was not merely surprising. It was, within the categories of their world, the single most disqualifying possible claim about Jesus. In the first century Jewish world, a man who was crucified by Rome was not a martyr. He was not a tragic hero. He was a criminal, a blasphemer, or a failed revolutionary. Crucifixion was not simply a method of execution. It was a declaration by the authorities that this person was cursed. The Torah itself, in the book of Deuteronomy, states that anyone who dies by hanging on a tree is under the curse of God. This is not a minor textual footnote. It was central to why the religious authorities wanted Jesus crucified rather than stoned. Stoning was the Jewish method of execution for blasphemy. Crucifixion placed the victim under the explicit covenantal curse of God. It was, from within the logic of the Torah, the ultimate theological refutation of any messianic claim. A crucified Messiah was not a mysterious or paradoxical claim in first-century Jerusalem. It was a self-contradicting one. The Messiah was supposed to defeat Israel's enemies, restore the kingdom, rebuild the temple, and reign. A Messiah who was arrested, tortured, and publicly executed under the sign of divine curse was, by definition, not the Messiah. Not a failed Messiah, not a disappointing Messiah. Simply not the Messiah. Every single one of the disciples knew this. They had grown up with the Torah. They understood what crucifixion meant. And yet within weeks of the crucifixion, not years, not decades, not after the story had time to evolve and soften and be reinterpreted by people who were not there, within weeks, in the very city where the execution had taken place, the same disciples who had scattered in fear on Friday night were standing in public declaring that this crucified man was the Messiah, the Son of God, and that he had physically risen from the dead. This requires an explanation. Let us reconstruct the morning of the resurrection as carefully as the available evidence allows. The four gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written within the first century by men who either witnessed the events directly or gathered testimony from those who did. The scholarly debate about their precise dating is complex, but even the most conservative academic estimates place Mark's gospel within 40 years of the events it describes, early enough that living eyewitnesses could and did challenge its contents if they were inaccurate. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, which contains the earliest written account of the resurrection appearances, was composed approximately 20 years after the crucifixion. In it, Paul cites what most scholars recognize as a creedal formula, a standardized list of resurrection appearances that he himself received, presumably in Damascus or Jerusalem, within a few years of the events themselves. We are not dealing with mythology that accumulated over centuries. We are dealing with testimony recorded within living memory of the events. With that established, let us enter the morning. The first day of the week in the Jewish calendar began at sundown on Saturday. By the time the sky began to lighten on Sunday, the Sabbath restrictions had lifted. The city would have been stirring, the pre-dawn movement of bakers, of priests beginning their morning preparations, of pilgrims who had stayed through the festival days and were now preparing for the journey home. The three gospel accounts of the women's visit to the tomb, those of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, specify that the women came while it was still dark, or very early in the morning at sunrise. The Gospel of John specifies early on the first day of the week while it was still dark. There is a cluster of witnesses, all placing the discovery at the earliest possible moment of the first permissible day to act after the Sabbath rest. These women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and in Luke's account, Joanna, were coming for a practical purpose. They had prepared spices and ointments for the final anointing of the body, a process that had been interrupted by the hasty burial on Friday afternoon, when the onset of the Sabbath had imposed a hard deadline on every preparation. They were not coming in hope. They were coming in grief to complete the rites of mourning for a man they had loved and lost. They were discussing among themselves on the road a practical problem: the stone. The entrance to the tomb had been sealed with a large disk of stone, a common feature of the rock-cut tombs of the period, the archaeological evidence for which is abundant in the hillsides outside Jerusalem. The stone was not a pebble. It would have required several men to move. The women knew this, and they were uncertain how they would manage it. They did not need to. When they arrived at the garden, the stone had already been moved. Let us pause on the significance of this detail because it is often misread. The stone was not moved to let Jesus out. A resurrected body, as the Gospels will subsequently describe in considerable detail, was not bound by the physical constraints that required a stone to be rolled away. Jesus walks through locked doors. He appears in a closed room. He is not impeded by walls or seals. The stone was moved for the benefit of the witnesses, to allow them to see that the tomb was empty, to enter and verify, to understand that the impossibility they were about to encounter was not a trick of the light or a story they had been told, but a fact they could investigate with their own hands. The angel, described in Matthew and Mark as a young man in white, says to the women, "He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come, see the place where he lay." This is one of the most compressed sentences in the history of human communication. It contains a denial, "He is not here," a declaration, "He has risen," a reference to prior testimony, "just as he said," and an invitation to empirical verification. Come, see the place where he lay. In 9 words, it addresses the natural human responses of disbelief, grief, and the need for evidence. Come and see. Not trust us, not believe without looking, not accept this on authority. Come, look with your own eyes. The place where he lay is visible. The cloths in which he was wrapped are still there. The burial arrangement is intact, but the body is gone. There is a moment in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 3 through 8, that deserves more attention than it typically receives. When Mary Magdalene discovers the empty tomb, she runs to tell Peter and John. The 2 men race to the tomb. John, apparently the faster runner, arrives first. He stops at the entrance and looks in. He sees the linen cloths lying there, but he does not enter. Then Peter arrives, impetuous, direct, constitutionally incapable of stopping at a threshold when there was something to be investigated, and walks straight in. What Peter sees is this. The burial cloths are lying there, but the cloth that had been around Jesus' head was not lying with the linen cloths, but was folded up by itself, separately. This detail is recorded by an eyewitness. It is not a theological elaboration. It is a forensic observation, and it carries significant weight. If the body had been stolen, which was the immediate explanation offered by the religious authorities, who told the soldiers guarding the tomb to say that the disciples had come at night and taken the body away, then we must ask, who steals a body and takes the time to neatly fold the burial cloth? Grave robbers do not fold. Panicked disciples fleeing a guarded tomb do not fold. The act of folding a cloth in the darkness of a sealed tomb, with Roman guards presumably nearby, is not the action of any category of criminal or fraudster that we can reasonably construct. John records that when he entered and saw the arrangement of the cloths, he saw and believed. He does not tell us fully what he believed in that moment, whether he had grasped the entire theological weight of the resurrection, or whether he had simply understood that something had occurred that no human agency could account for. But the detail of the folded cloth was what moved him from confusion to conviction. It was a detail that did not fit the narrative of theft or deception. It was a detail that pointed to intentionality, to a departure that was deliberate, unhurried, and sovereign. The evidence case for the resurrection rests on a convergence of factors that historians of the period, including secular historians, have found genuinely difficult to explain away. The tomb was empty. This is conceded by the earliest opponents of the resurrection claim. The religious authorities in Jerusalem did not deny the empty tomb. They explained it. They said the disciples had stolen the body. That explanation is itself an implicit acknowledgement that the tomb was empty. You do not invent a story about grave robbers if the grave is not empty. The disciples underwent a radical transformation. These are the same men who, on the night of the arrest, fled. Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times to a servant girl in a courtyard. The rest, with the exception of John, were not even present at the crucifixion. They were hiding. The Gospel of John records that after the crucifixion, the disciples gathered in a locked room for fear of the Jewish leaders. This is not the description of men preparing a conspiracy. This is the description of men who were afraid for their lives, whose leader had been executed in the most publicly shameful way possible, and who had every reason to return quietly to Galilee and resume fishing. Within weeks, these same men were standing in the temple courtyard, the center of the very religious establishment that had engineered the crucifixion, and publicly proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. Within a generation, they had carried that message to Rome, to Egypt, to Asia Minor, to Greece. Not one of them, under interrogation, imprisonment, torture, or the immediate prospect of execution, recanted. Not one offered the authorities what the authorities most wanted, a location for the body, or a confession that the story had been invented. People die for things they believe to be true, but people rarely die for things they know to be false. A conspiracy of that complexity, maintained that completely under that degree of pressure by that many separate individuals, without a single defector, is, from a purely historical standpoint, implausible to the point of being functionally impossible. The resurrection appearances are reported not as spiritual visions, but as physical encounters. Paul, writing to the Corinthians approximately 20 years after the crucifixion, lists the appearances in what scholars widely recognize as a creedal formula he received earlier. To Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still living. An explicit appeal to living witnesses that would have been an absurd lie to include if there were 500 people who could deny it. Then to James, then to all the apostles, and finally to Paul himself. This list is not poetry, it is testimony. It has the structure of legal evidence. It names categories of witnesses and invites verification. The conversion of James. This is, in many ways, the most underappreciated piece of evidence in the resurrection case. James, the brother of Jesus, was not a follower during Jesus' public ministry. The Gospel of John notes explicitly that Jesus' brothers did not believe in him. After the crucifixion, James would have had every reason to feel a combination of grief, shame, and relief that his family's humiliation was at least over. Instead, within a short period of the crucifixion, James became not merely a believer, but one of the central leaders of the Jerusalem church, a man described by Paul, a hostile witness who had himself been an opponent of the movement, as the Lord's brother. James was eventually executed by the Sanhedrin for his faith. He was not executed for defending a fond memory of a dead sibling. He was executed for the specific claim that his brother, whom he had known since childhood, had risen from the dead. What changes a skeptical brother into a martyr? The evidence of the resurrection accounts suggests one thing: a personal appearance from the risen Jesus to James. Paul includes it in his list, and then there is Paul himself. Saul of Tarsus was not a confused or ignorant man. He was one of the most educated individuals of his generation, a student of Gamaliel, the foremost rabbinic teacher of the age, a Pharisee of Pharisees, fluent in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, trained in both the tradition of his fathers and the wider intellectual culture of the Hellenistic world. He was also a man who regarded the followers of Jesus as a dangerous and blasphemous heresy that needed to be suppressed by force. He held the coats of the men who stoned Stephen. He was, by his own account, violently persecuting the church, dragging men and women to prison, and causing the deaths of believers. He was not looking for Jesus. He was hunting his followers. And then, on the road to Damascus, something happened that he describes, in the most personally costly possible way, as an encounter with the risen Jesus. Not a vision, not a dream. An encounter that blinded him for 3 days, that required a member of the very community he had been persecuting to restore his sight. And that transformed him, from that moment forward, into the most tireless and effective advocate for the resurrection that the ancient world would ever see. A man who would spend the rest of his life under conditions of hardship, danger, imprisonment, beatings, shipwreck, and eventual execution, and who never wavered, not once, on the central claim that Jesus of Nazareth had risen from the dead and had appeared to him personally. What does one do with Paul? The skeptical account must explain how a man of his caliber, intellectually sophisticated, theologically informed, personally hostile to the movement, with every social and professional incentive to remain in his current position, underwent a transformation so total and so permanent that it redirected the entire course of his life toward the very thing he had been trying to destroy. Let us enter the accounts of the resurrection appearances themselves, because they are unlike any literature in the ancient world. They do not read like mythology. The mythology of resurrection in the ancient world, the stories of Osiris, of Dionysus, of Adonis, is characterized by a particular texture, cosmic scale, symbolic abstraction, the language of agricultural cycles, and heavenly drama. These stories do not name specific people in specific places. They do not track the confusion and disorientation and tentative, uncertain recognition of actual human beings confronting something they did not expect. The resurrection appearances in the Gospels are awkward in a way that mythology never is. They are full of the texture of actual events. Mary Magdalene, standing outside the empty tomb weeping, turns and sees a man she does not recognize. She assumes he is the gardener. She asks him if he knows where the body has been taken. And then the man says her name, just her name, one word, and she knows immediately who he is. This is not the structure of legend. This is the structure of a real moment. The confusion of grief that prevents recognition. The single word that breaks through it. The gasp of recognition that follows. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus walk for several miles with a stranger who opens the scriptures to them and interprets everything that Moses and the prophets had written about the Messiah. Their hearts burn within them as he speaks, a phrase that suggests not just intellectual excitement, but the particular emotion of recognition that has not yet reached conscious understanding. They arrive at their destination and urge the stranger to stay with them because it is late. He does. He breaks bread. And in the moment of breaking the bread, that specific, repeated ritual gesture that they had seen him perform so many times before, their eyes are opened and they recognize him. And in the moment of recognition, he vanishes, not dramatically, not with thunder. He simply ceases to be visible. The disciples return to Jerusalem immediately, that same evening, and find the 11 already saying the same thing. The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon. The shared testimony accumulates, multiple independent witnesses separately saying the same impossible thing. Then Jesus himself stands in the middle of the gathered group, and they are terrified. They think they are seeing a ghost. This is a critical detail because it demonstrates something about the nature of the appearances that is frequently missed. The disciples did not interpret the resurrection appearances through a pre-existing framework that made them easy to accept. They were frightened. They did not recognize him. Their first instinct, when they saw him in the room, was to assume they were seeing a spirit, which, in their world, was a deeply troubling thing to see, not a comforting one. And Jesus responds to their fear not with theological proclamation, but with the most empirical possible gesture. Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have. He shows them his hands and feet. And then, while they are still disbelieving because of joy and amazement, that extraordinary phrase that Luke uses, this state of being too astonished to believe even what you are looking at. He asks them if they have anything to eat. They give him a piece of broiled fish. He eats it in front of them. A resurrected spiritual metaphor does not eat broiled fish in front of eyewitnesses. A grief-induced hallucination does not eat fish. A legend constructed decades later to comfort a persecuted community does not eat fish. This detail is in the text because it happened, and the person who included it understood that it was evidence, the kind of evidence that ordinary people understood. A man who can eat is not a ghost. And then there is Thomas. Thomas, called the twin, was not present at the first appearance. When the other disciples told him they had seen the Lord, he refused to believe them. Not hesitantly, not with the openness of a man looking for more information. Categorically, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. This is the response of a rational man living in a world where the dead do not rise. It is not unreasonable. It is, in fact, exactly the response we would expect from someone who had not been present for the experience that had convinced the others. 8 days later, Jesus appears again. Thomas is present, and Jesus, without any recorded explanation from Thomas, having been absent from the previous gathering, addresses Thomas directly. "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." The Gospel does not tell us whether Thomas actually touched the wounds. What it tells us is Thomas's response: "My Lord and my God." Not "my teacher." Not "my master." My Lord and my God. This is the first time in the New Testament that a human being directly addresses Jesus with the full title of deity, and it comes from the most skeptical disciple, from the man who had flatly refused to believe on the testimony of multiple witnesses, from the man who set the highest possible empirical standard, physical contact with the wounds, before he would accept the claim. The most famous doubter in Christian history becomes its most articulate confessor. Let us step back from the immediate narrative and consider what the resurrection, if it is true, means. Not what it means liturgically, not what it means as a symbol in the calendar of religious practice, what it means for the fundamental questions of human existence, questions that every civilization in every era of history has asked in different languages and different frameworks, but which resolve themselves always into the same essential inquiries. What are we? Why are we here? What happens when we die? Is there any ground beneath the uncertainty that we can actually stand on? The resurrection does not address these questions abstractly. It addresses them by example. If a man who was unambiguously dead walked out of a sealed tomb under his own power, a man whose death was confirmed by professional executioners, whose body was buried by people who knew him, whose tomb was guarded by soldiers who were betting their careers on nothing going wrong, then death is not what we thought it was. Not that death is painless, not that death is avoidable, not that death doesn't happen. It does happen. Jesus of Nazareth died. Really, completely died. The physical death recorded by the Romans and confirmed by the separation of blood and water that John, standing right there, watched come from the spear wound in his side, which is what happens to blood that has pooled in the chest cavity of a corpse and been disturbed. He was dead, and then he wasn't. If that is true, then the universe is not a closed system in which death is the final word. It is a system with a God who is not imprisoned inside it, a God who can act from outside the order of nature precisely because he created the order of nature. The resurrection is not a violation of nature from this perspective. It is a demonstration that the creator of nature is not bound by its ordinary operations. He built the machine. He can open the hood. And what does this God turn out to be like? This is the question that the resurrection forces to the surface with a specificity that abstract theology never quite achieves. Because the resurrection does not reveal a God who is powerful in the abstract. It reveals a God who is specifically like Jesus, the man who wept at Lazarus's tomb, the man who noticed a widow's 2-coin offering and called it the most generous gift in the temple, the man who touched lepers when no one touched lepers, the man who looked at the rich young ruler who turned away from discipleship and loved him anyway, the man who said to the woman caught in adultery, dragged before him for judgment, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." The man who, while hanging on a cross, suffocating in the process of execution, noticed the criminal dying beside him and said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." The resurrection says that this is what God is like, not a projection of human wishful thinking onto the cosmos, because this is not the God that human beings, left to their own devices, would invent. Human-invented gods tend toward power, demand, retributive justice, favoritism toward those who appeal to them correctly. The God revealed in the resurrection favors the outcast, the broken, the woman who is being stoned, the disciple who just betrayed him 3 times. The God who rose from the dead is the God who washed his disciples' feet the night before he died. That is not what power looks like. That is what love looks like when it has nowhere left to compromise. The Apostle Paul, reflecting on the implications of the resurrection in his letter to the Romans, writes, "If the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies, because of his Spirit who lives in you." This is not a comfort verse. This is a metaphysical claim. The same power that operated in the garden tomb on the morning of the first day of the week is, Paul argues, available as an active principle in every human being who comes into relationship with the God who exercised it. The resurrection is not a one-time event. It is a direction of travel, the first of a new kind. As Paul describes Jesus, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. First of a new kind, not the only one. The first. It is possible to trace the effects of the resurrection backward from where we stand, and the exercise is humbling in its scope. Within 300 years of a single Sunday morning in Jerusalem, the resurrection message had reached the official ideology of the most powerful empire the Western world had ever known. By the middle of the 1st century, it had spread across the Roman Empire's road network with a speed and penetration that bears no parallel in the history of religious movements. It moved not by force. The early church had no army, but by testimony. By the simple act of one person telling another what they had seen, or what someone they trusted had seen, or what the experience of living inside this new reality felt like. The early Christians, the people in Antioch who were first called by the name that would eventually be used for 2 billion human beings, were not primarily distinguished by their doctrinal correctness or their organizational sophistication. They were distinguished, as the historian Rodney Stark has documented, by how they behaved during plague. When the Antonine Plague devastated the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, and again during the plague of Cyprian. In the 3rd, the overwhelming pattern of Roman society was flight. Those who could leave, left. Those who could not were abandoned. The sick were pushed into the streets. The dead went unburied. The Christians stayed. They stayed because they had a theology of death that was different from the rest of the Roman world. They believed that death was not the end. They believed that a man had walked out of a tomb on a Sunday morning, and that his life, his actual, personal, bodily life, was available to everyone who came to him in faith. This belief did not make them suicidal or reckless. It made them free. Free in a way that no earthly threat could easily dismantle, because the threat that underlies all other threats, the threat of death, had been publicly and physically addressed. So they stayed. They nursed the sick. They buried the dead. They did this for strangers as well as for members of their communities. And the numerical consequence, which Stark tracks with careful demographic reasoning, was that Christian communities survived the plagues at significantly higher rates than non-Christian communities, both because basic nursing care genuinely improves survival rates for dehydration-related illness, and because the Christians who survived the first wave had developed immunity. The community that stayed grew. The community that fled shrank. In the biological arithmetic of pandemic, the resurrection produced a competitive advantage that secular historians can measure without invoking theology at all. The hospitals of the ancient world, the first institutions that provided medical care to strangers free of charge without regard to social status, emerged from communities that took the resurrection seriously. The tradition of caring for the sick, the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the tradition that produced over centuries the infrastructure of social welfare that modern secular societies inherited and in many cases deprivatized into state systems, traces its genealogy back to a group of people who believed that a dead man had risen and that what he had said about the value of every human life was therefore true. The music, the architecture, the art, the philosophy, the legal traditions of human dignity and individual rights, the universities, virtually all of the first universities in the Western world, were founded on resurrection theology, on the belief that a God who raised the dead was a God in whose image rational, curious, knowledge-seeking creatures were made, and that the study of his creation was therefore a form of worship. The scientific method itself, as historians of science from Alfred North Whitehead forward have argued, emerged in a cultural context shaped by the conviction that the universe was rational because it was made by a rational God, a conviction whose narrative ground was the resurrection of Jesus. Whether one accepts the resurrection as historical fact or not, one cannot honestly look at the world that was made in its wake and regard it as trivial. And yet, the resurrection refuses to remain a historical question. This is what distinguishes it from virtually every other event in ancient history. You can study the campaigns of Julius Caesar with complete academic detachment. You can analyze the philosophy of Plato without being personally implicated in your conclusions. You can write a doctoral dissertation on the Peloponnesian War without its findings rearranging your life. You cannot study the resurrection that way, not because it demands irrationality or the surrender of critical inquiry. It doesn't. But because the nature of the claim is such that if it is true, it addresses you personally, not humanity in the abstract. You by name. This is what the risen Jesus said to Mary Magdalene in the garden when she finally recognized him. Not a proclamation to the masses, not a declaration to the religious authorities or to Pilate. He said her name. One word, personal, singular. The God who made the universe said the name of a woman who had come to anoint a body at dawn, who was standing in a garden weeping, and she knew it was him. This is the shape of the resurrection in human experience, not the thunderous public vindication that we might design for a God who has just defeated death. A quiet garden, a single name spoken, a woman's grief becoming in one moment the most extraordinary joy the world had ever seen. 2,000 years later, the claim stands exactly where it stood on that Sunday morning. It has been attacked from every angle: historical, philosophical, scientific, textual, anthropological. It has survived every attack, not because the attacks were not serious. Some of them have been very serious indeed, but because the alternatives have, on examination, turned out to require greater improbability than the claim itself. An empty tomb that everyone conceded was empty. Eyewitnesses who died rather than recant, a hostile sibling who became a martyr, a persecutor who became an apostle, a movement that spread at extraordinary speed through a hostile empire, without military force, entirely on the basis of testimony, and produced in its wake institutions of care and inquiry and beauty that the world had never seen. The question is not, can we explain the resurrection within the categories of a closed material universe? The question is the universe closed? And if the God who raised Jesus from the dead is real, if the garden on that Sunday morning was what the witnesses said it was, then the universe is not closed. The evidence that it isn't is still in the world, still producing effects, still asking the same question. It asked the disciples in that locked room when he stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Not, "Have you figured this out?" Not, "Do you have a satisfying theological framework?" Peace. In the middle of your confusion, in the middle of your failure and your grief and your carefully reasonable objections, peace. Because the thing you were most afraid of, the finality of death, the silence at the end of everything, has been answered. Not with an argument, with a man standing in a room, asking for something to eat. There is a detail in the Gospel of John's resurrection account that is easy to pass over, but which contains more than it appears to at first reading. After Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene in the garden and she recognizes him, he says to her, "Do not hold on to me." Some translations render this as, "Do not cling to me." He is going somewhere. He is not available to be held in place by her grief or her love or her desire to have him back exactly as he was. The resurrection is not a restoration to the former state. It is a transformation into a new one. Go instead to my brothers and tell them. This is the structure of every genuine encounter with the resurrection. Recognition, transformation, mission. The same pattern plays out in every subsequent appearance. The disciples on the road to Emmaus recognize him, and he immediately vanishes. He is not there to be kept. He is there to be carried forward. Thomas confesses him as Lord and God, and Jesus responds not with comfortable congratulation, but with an observation that contains a commission. "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Blessed are those who have not seen. That is the moment at which the resurrection steps out of the first century and walks directly into the present. Because we have not seen. We were not in the garden on Sunday morning. We did not eat breakfast with the risen Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, as the Gospel of John records he did. A fire of coals burning, fish cooking, bread waiting, the smell of breakfast in the early morning air over the water. the most astonishingly ordinary scene in which an extraordinary thing had been casually inserted. We were not there, and yet the offer stands. The same offer that was extended to Mary in the garden, to Thomas in the room, to the 500 at once, most of whom were still living when Paul wrote about them, to the disciples at breakfast by the lake, to Saul of Tarsus on a road in Syria. The same evidence is available to us, the same convergence of historical testimony, the same emptiness of the alternatives, the same quality of what was built by the people who believed it. All of this remains accessible to anyone who is willing to look at it honestly. But the resurrection never was primarily an academic question. It is an invitation to the same experience that turned frightened, hiding, grieving fishermen and tax collectors into the people who walked into the Roman Empire and offered it a different future. Not a political program, not a military campaign, a person, a name, a morning that has not in 2,000 years come to an end. The stone is still rolled away. The place where he lay is still visible, and the invitation is still exactly what the angel said at the entrance of the empty tomb. Come, see. He is not here. He has risen.